going to start recording now.
Okay. I'll just do a brief revision again of what's going to be on the text. So I might ask, like, who were the three main groups that wanted the land in North America? So that was the British, the French, and the First Nations people. And then they came to Canada, North America. They were coming for over 200 years. And they were getting sources of income through trade. So they would take back some things from North America to Europe. They would take fur because they had a very high demand for fur for fashion. And they would take back fresh fish because there was not a lot of fresh fish in Europe because of the high population. So they had that very high demand. And then one thing is that they all wanted the land, right? So there was a lot of disputed territory. Disputed territory is territory that everybody thinks belongs to them, right? And then what happened is that in the early 1600s, French and England tried to make their claims on North America stronger, right? So these two groups, these two European groups, right, the French and the British, they wanted to make their claim. They all wanted to claim the land. So how did they make it stronger? Is that they developed territories over there, right? They established settlements. Right, so then, you know, some of them settled in Toronto, some of them settled in Montreal, some of them in Vancouver, and various places in North America, right? So they were trying to move ahead. They were trying to make the country look like it was theirs. The first English settlement was in Newfoundland. Okay, so the British, where did they settle first, Mahnur? Newfoundland. Okay, so they the English focused their settlements along the coast because they did a lot of fishing, right? So Newfoundland, we know, is on the coast of the coast, right? The French, and then the French, they settled in, where did the French settle? They settled in present-day Montreal. Okay, so this might come in the test. Where did the British settle? They settled in Newfoundland, and the French, they settled in Montreal. The reason, and what's the reason? So the reason the British settled in Newfoundland was because they did fishing, so they settled along the water. The reason that the reason that the French settled in Montreal is because they did a lot of fur trade, and that's where they could get fur from the First Nations. So they didn't, as I mentioned before, they didn't used to hunt for this fur themselves. They used to get it from the First Nations people. Yeah, we can see that. Okay, so now let's go over chapter 2. Those are some questions that might come in chapter 1. You can't see my screen, right? Mahnur? Mahnur, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I was talking and you weren't replying. Okay, so second chapter, how did the land change after the Treaty of Utrecht? Okay, we learned about this treaty that they all went through. A treaty is a piece, something, you know, that they come to agreements with something to have peace. A treaty is an agreement signed between different countries in which promises are made. Okay, so there was a treaty that happened, right? We did this lesson in the past, right? Okay. Yes. The United Kingdom of Great British, also known as Britain, formed in 1707 when England and Scotland united. It was ruled by Queen Anne and joined many European countries in fighting against France. peace talks followed the war and led to the treaty. Okay, so before British and French, they were at war, right? Sorry, French and many other European countries, right? So after they formed a treaty of peace, right? And then in this treaty, they said that, you know, British will own this land in North America and French will own this land in North America. So before they were disputed, but now it became clear who will own what in North America, right? So what did they decide in the treaty? Yeah, who will own what land in North America? This might come in the test, the quiz. Okay, what was decided in the treaty?
What was decided in the treaty?
In the treaty, there was decided that the borders were clear, because in those times, borders between cities was not clear. So the borders became clear, and who owned what land was decided. For example, the British will own the Eastern Canada, the French will own Southern Canada, right? So these type of things were decided in the treaty. Okay, so today New Brunswick is the only Canadian, one second. Okay, so the first thing that happened after the treaty was that they created new maps. Okay, so the map of Canada, it's changed a lot throughout the years. So the first thing they decided in the treaty was to create a new map signaling how the country was divided. Okay. Okay, so even after the treaty was signed, there was still some disputed territory, right? Was because they didn't know exactly what land they were claiming. So they still had some land that was still had some land that they hadn't discovered yet. So there was still some land that was undecided. Okay, European and First Nations relations. Okay, so what's the relationship between the actual people who lived in the country first, the First Nations people, right? And the Europeans negotiated and signed the treaty. They did not consult First Nations about their claims to the land or about the terms of the treaty. However, part of the treaty, such as Section 8, referred to First Nations. Okay, so they decided this whole treaty, you will own this land, this will own this land, but they did not even consult with the First Nations. And the First Nations were there before anybody even came there, right? The Europeans even came there. Trading relationships. The treaty had been signed and was considered by some to be a time of peace amongst the French, British, and First Nations. However, the French and the British were back in competition for fur trade. Okay, so first of all, their first argument was over land. After the peace treaty was signed, that was kind of after the Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes, I can hear you. Yes, I can hear you. Sis Saada, can you hear me?
Okay, so after the peace treaty was signed, their whole argument about land, it was, they had an agreement. But the second argument was about fur trade. So this was not solved yet. Okay, what was their second argument?
Fur trade.
Fur trade. Their first argument was about the land, and the second was about fur trade. Okay, the British wanted to strengthen trading relations with some First Nations people after the treaty. Many First Nations people believed that trading with the British would benefit their people. So the First Nations knew that if we did trading with British, it will be very good for us, it will benefit us. Okay, this belief led to the expansion of trading relationship between First Nations and British. So who did the First Nations prefer to do trading with?
British.
The British, exactly. Good. This might come in the quiz as well. I hope you're taking notes or you're remembering all of these things so that you can remember in the quiz.
But student Miss Sabha is doing the recording, right?
Yes, she's doing the recording. Okay, so you know, after the Europeans settled in North America, they forced many First Nations people from their homes. So did they ask them to leave peacefully? No. They forced some of them out of their homes. And the second thing they did was they even killed some of the First Nations or sold them into slavery. So this is, you know, they came into this land forcefully and they even killed the people who were living here first, right? Just for the land. Okay, so a lot of First Nations people, they were chased away or killed by British settlers who were seeking land, right? Okay, let's go to the next lesson. I think that's all for this one. Okay, how did the Treaty of Utrecht affect relations in North America? So what happened after the treaty, right? The treaty decided who will own what land, right? And then what happened after that? Okay, after this treaty, the British and the France agreed to stop fighting one another, right? They, how would these factors affect the relationship among the different groups living here? Was this really a period of peace or was it a state of uncertainty, right? Even though they decided, they were still enemies. They were still competitors, right? By 1713, there had been many years of conflict among the French and the British and the First Nations people living in North America, right? 1 second. Although the French and the British had established peace, First Nations had been left out of that process. Okay, so the First Nations were left out. Okay, let's just forget this.
Then they went after the First Nations.
Yes. After ending the war with the French, the British wanted to continue to explore and expand their territory. To help gain more land and create stability, the British needed to repair relationships with the First Nations, particularly the Wabanaki Confederacy. The French and the Wabanaki Confederacy had an alliance. Okay, so what happened is that the British, even though they were given land, they still wanted more, right? They always wanted more and more land. So they said that we will go to these people and try to get their land. But these Wabanaki people, they were already allies with the French. Allies means a type of agreement between people or groups to achieve a common goal. Okay. Okay, I don't think there's anything that important in this one. Let's just go to the next lesson. Oh, we already did this one. What shaped Canadian culture? Okay, so what shaped Canadian culture? Okay, most of the Canadian settlers who lived along the St. Lawrence River were farmers called habitants. The settlements of the habitants were part of the system that you learned about in chapter 1. Okay, okay, so the first thing that, you know, shaped Canadian culture was the settlement, right? So the French people, they lived in present-day Quebec. The British people, they lived in along the coast, right? So depending on where they settled, that really helped shape the Canadian culture. The second thing was their fur trade, right? So fur trade was a very large thing, a very large source of income for all three, right? So the who actually found the fur and you know, hunted for the fur?
first people?
The First Nations, and then they would sell it to the British and the French, right? So these people, these two groups, they didn't do it by themselves, they would buy it from them. Okay. So that was a very large source of income for the British and for the French. Number 3, religion. Okay, which religion was predominant in North America at that time? Right, a lot of the people were Catholic and Protestant. By 1713, French settlers had begun living in New France for more than 2 or 3 generations. Most had never lived in France or visited Europe. However, they still held the same religious beliefs as those living in France, right? So their religion was Catholic. They were Catholic, right? Because that was the religion they had in France. The French king only permitted Catholics to settle in New France. So they would send people from France. So which religion? He would only allow people who were Catholic to move to North America, right? Okay, yeah, that's the only thing we need to read about. Okay, the Canadians demonstrated their Catholic beliefs in traditional ways. For example, they painted paintings, which are paintings by ordinary people that express thanks to Catholic saints for miracles. Okay, so one way they showed, their love for their religion was through painting. So if you can see in this picture, right? So this played a very large role for them. Okay, number 4 was Canadian women. That also played a very large part. And then number 5 was education and business opportunities, right? Greater access to education was another way Canadian women could become more independent, right? So they wanted independence. They wanted this different type that they live, a different type of way from in Europe, right? So through education, the women, they gained more of an independence. Yeah, oh, I think we're done. So these were a few things that helped shape Canadian culture. Okay, so, let's just do one more. Why was fur trade significant? Then we'll finish it off here. Okay, why was fur trade significant, right?
Why trade was significant?
Sorry?
Now we're doing a chapter about fur trade.
Yes, so why was fur trade significant? This is the chapter of this lesson, okay? Let's see, I'll just read the important part because it's so long. 1 minute. Okay, the British colonies grew steadily along the eastern coast of North America. The settlers did not grow as fast as the British colonies, right? The Canadians needed more ways to sustain themselves, so they entered fur trade. Okay, so the French were not as stable as the British. So they said we need to find something that will make us more stable and have more money and have a better economy. So then they decided to enter fur trade. So the French, they entered fur. I might ask this question, why did the French enter fur trade? Right? To make themselves more established in North America and have a better economy and create more jobs so they could have more people living there. That's why they entered into fur trade. Fur trade was a very, very large source of income, meaning they got a lot of money from this source. Right? And then partnering with First Nations. For more than 200 years, the French and First Nations developed relationships that were useful to both groups, right? So the First Nations, they had a partnership with the French, right? So why was it beneficial for both groups? Because first of all, the French could get fur from them. This was a good source of income for them, creating more jobs, more sustainability, more settlement, and it was beneficial for the First Nations because they would also, when they gave the fur to the the French, sorry, they didn't just give it for free, they would sell it to them. So they were getting more money as well, right? So it's beneficial for both the groups. Okay, let's leave it off there. Actually. Okay, we'll leave it off there. And then we'll do a revision for geography tomorrow, inshallah. Yeah, we'll do a revision for geography tomorrow, and also I will send the pictures of the lesson, the paragraphs that you guys should read from, inshallah, okay? So you can study over the weekend. Okay, Allah Hafiz.